Are you ready to rewind? Take a nostalgia-filled ride back to a simpler time. It's Acid Wash Memories, a retro pop culture celebration. And now your hosts, Joe Murata and Michael Quinn.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode number 98 of Acid Wash Memories, a retro pop culture celebration. Today, it's all about the Beatles Anthology. I am Joe Murata, alongside our very own Ringo Starr himself, Michael Quinn. How you doing there, Ringo?
Howdy ho.
Hello there.
Mates. What does he say?
Yeah, he might say mates.
Mates.
Thank you, mates, for being with us here, whether you're on our side of the pond or across or anywhere else in between. We certainly appreciate you being with us here as we talk about the Beatles Anthology. And if this happens to be your first time, we do have 97 other episodes available where, Quinn?
In the archives.
In the archives. An anthology of episodes, if you will.
Shut up.
And you can, of course, follow us on Twitter at AWM Podcast and join our Facebook group, Acid Wash Memories, on Facebook. All right, that's the particulars. I want to mention something here, Quinn, before we even get into the Beatles Anthology portion of it. Over the almost 2 years we've been doing this show, a lot of people have been like, when are you doing a Beatles episode? And for me, it's like, well, wait a second now. Every album the Beatles did, every song the Beatles did could be an episode.
That's true.
Because they have such lore, right? Is there a lot of lore?
They have the lore. I know, like, some people, like, you know how we did when we did Lucy, it's like the origin of sitcoms?
Yeah.
They're like kind of like one of the origin bands of rock and roll, like pop. In the mainstream,
and pop.
I guess. Yeah.
And a lot of things.
They're kind of like a core thing. In a sense, they've kind of become classical music for the modern era, right? This is what it should be. They're the model.
They set a lot of templates, even if they didn't, invent them. They certainly set a lot of them. For anyone that doesn't know, the Beatles are and have been since I could remember
you ever hear
music.
Of the Beatles?
Yeah, they're my favorite band. If anyone listening, I want to disclaim this now, so listen up. If anyone listening is also a very hardcore Beatle fan, you are going to notice that in this episode, I'm going to be very broad about certain bits of information because we're not here to tell the story of the Beatles. Again, that would take many episodes.
We're here to tell the story of the Beatles in the Beatles Anthology.
Exactly. Yes. How we got there, why it mattered, and what happened afterwards. And I'm going to guide you through that. And Quinn, of course, is a Beatle fan, not as hardcore as I am.
Not as hardcore, but I definitely like the Beatles. Who doesn't like the Beatles?
Right. I'm sure some listeners are going to give us some S for that. But
right.
And what your feeling is about the Time magazine criticism of the music that is being written today?
We were just trying to write songs about prostitutes and lesbians, that's all.
You also have seen Beatles Anthology.
Yeah.
You're familiar with this.
I remember when it aired. Do you remember what channel it was on? Because I absolutely do not.
A Beatles C.
The wait is over. The Beatles Anthology tonight at 9/8 Central on A Beatles C.
I do remember it being an event. Right,
Oh,
it
yeah.
was like this thing. It's like my dad was like, "Okay, we got to watch it now. Like it's important or something."
It
like,
was important,
right? Like this is the most important thing to ever happen or something.
And that's kind of the story that we're going to tell here is why this was such a big deal and the fallout from it. And whether you love or like or hate the Beatles, you've definitely heard of them. And even here in 2024, as we record this, their music is still insanely popular in terms of streaming. Right, their images are iconic. Their legend and their influence are inescapable. And, they have re-releases, they have super deluxe releases, they have rare songs, new quote-unquote songs.
Right.
We're constantly reminded, even in 2024, of John, Paul, George, and Ringo. They're still a brand in the present day. And this is some 60 years after they started.
Now, this Beatles Anthology, though, Joe, right?
Yes, sir.
Now, this was kind of... I always felt like this was like the beginning of the like they're legends now or something, right? It's like, you know what I'm saying? It's like, because like in the 80s they had like the CD re-release of everything, but that was just kind of like some reissue shit, right?
And
this
that was
is
a
just
necessity.
Like, this is like, it's kind of like when DVD came out. It's like, oh, you got to convert all your stuff to this, right?
Exactly.
Like
right.
It wasn't like some big important thing. It was like, oh, it's now on CD, cool, right? But now this, on the other hand, this was like a project, and this was like now the Beatles are legendary, right? They have an anthology.
You nailed it, Quinn. Much of what we view, we meaning people our age, a little older, and younger generations, right? The Beatles that we see now in 2024 as a united legacy brand, right? Mm-hmm. There's only 2 surviving members, but the brand is very much active, right?
Yeah.
That started with the Beatles Anthology. It wasn't the reason for it. It was the mechanism that allowed it to come back. Anthology was the first product of that mechanism.
Correct.
If that makes sense. Now, again, without getting into a detailed history, I'm going to give you the Crib Notes version here, or the Cliff Notes, if you will. At Cliff. There's a lot of history. Here's the bullet points just to fulfill the minimum requirements of doing a Beatles podcast, okay? John Lennon founded the Quarrymen, a skiffle band in the 50s. In 1957, he met the younger Paul McCartney, himself a guitar player, and Paul McCartney joined the group. And soon after, Paul's friend George Harrison, even younger than Paul McCartney, he joined, and he was possibly even a better guitar player than Paul or John. Okay, eventually the Quarrymen, who were playing skiffle, and skiffle was kind of like a trendy cross between like country music and rockabilly in the 50s.
Yeah.
Like it was very like DIY. That gave way to rock and roll.
Right.
Because obviously Elvis, Little Richard, Carl Perkins, a lot of these guys were huge
This
in the
is the
50s.
history we know, right?
Exactly. They sifted through a few different names before settling on the Beatles, Beatles. There was a Silver Beatles, a bunch of different ones.
Well, I had a vision when I was 12, and I saw a man on a flaming pie, and he said, "You are Beatles with an A," and we are.
They had a fifth member known as Stu Sutcliffe, rudimentary bass player, also an artist. And Pete Best, famously, was their main drummer from 1960 until August of 1962.
I feel like this is that Pete Best thing is the factoid your parents like to always. I remember Pete Best. It's like, remember Pete Best?
He is Pete Best. He was the original drummer in this group until he was bumped for Ringo. That took place in 1962. He is now out of the music business.
And again, every line that we have spoken so far is its own podcast.
Yeah.
Like, I'm really not
It's
kidding.
true. Yeah.
When John Met Paul, that's a podcast. Pete Best and the Beatles, that's an episode. So I'm skimming through this because we have a point to make.
Right.
Okay. So Pete Best was unceremoniously fired from the Beatles in August of 62 because they wanted someone to take his place. And that person was a notable Liverpool drummer, a very good one, for another local band in Liverpool known as Rory and the Hurricanes. His name was Richard Starkey, then and still known as Ringo Starr.
Ringo.
And I was with Rory, and we went away, play another holiday camp, and I got a phone call. Can you join the Beatles? This was Wednesday. I said, when? And Brian Epstein said, oh, today. I said, no, I can't go today. I'm in a band here. We have to sort this out. I'll be there Saturday.
So now we have John, Paul, George, and Ringo, August 62. This is where they debut at the Cavern Club, basement club in Liverpool. They record their first true single for EMI, Love Me Do, which allegedly hit 17 on the charts. I say that because possibly their manager bought in a lot of copies to his record store.
Yeah, the charts are the charts.
But what was really popular was their follow-up single, Please Please Me.
Right.
That broke them into the UK mainstream, not
United
the US.
Kingdom.
Yes, the United.
Yeah.
Yes, to be clear, the United Kingdom, that UK.
Otherwise known as like England.
Yeah, Britain.
Greater Britain.
Yeah, or the Greatest Britain.
Yeah.
We're not sure yet.
Yes.
It's possible. Anyway, then they recorded an album. And this is important. Even though Please Please Me, which is their first UK album, which was released in 63, it's not by any means their most famous album.
Right.
Okay. Casual Beatle fans probably don't know it by name, but it has, for example, I Saw Her Standing There is on it, which is one of their big songs. And it closes with their big cover of Twist and Shout.
That's a great one.
The reason this album was such a big deal in the pop music scene of the time is because I disagree with this, but the sentiment is that there was no crap on it. There was no filler.
Well, that's what I've always thought about. See, this is the most basic thing about Beatles albums that makes them kind of awesome. I mostly find if you pick up any Beatles album, it doesn't matter which one it is, other than what's the one about the cartoon?
The Yellow Submarine album, yes. That album's weird.
That's excused.
Yes.
But because that's just like, I feel like it's like as if they made like a children's album or something.
Half of it's just like orchestral shit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But everything else, like the main line, as I like to call it.
Yes.
You can't really like listen to one and you're like, you can't. There's no part in it where you're like, this is crappy.
No,
Like
I know.
it just never happens. Like, and I think that's the important thing. And the other aspect too is all these years later, like the fact that everything's pretty good has this tone of like, hey, I know that song, or I know that like every single song is like, I've heard this before, right?
Exactly.
Like even if you're not like a huge music person, right?
Even if it wasn't in the 60s a radio hit, even if it wasn't released as a single, some of these songs have been played on classic rock radio for so long that they were minor album tracks at the time that are now famous.
It's spooky because it's almost like the entire discography, but usually when you say discography, people are talking about albums now. It's like the entire songography,
yes,
if you will, is good. Right?
Not that this is a measuring stick for success, but it should interest you that literally every Beatles song has its own entry on Wikipedia.
Huh.
Every song.
But that's more interesting, just the fact that it was actually like documented, like the writing of it or
this
something.
Is true.
Yeah, like, you know what I mean? Like that it was that. Why did people care enough to like write an entire Wikipedia entry on like some random shit? Like, why don't we do it in the road, like on Wikipedia? Like, is that necessary?
True.
Like, I like the song, but I mean, come on, man. Like, it doesn't need an essay about it.
That's
right?
the thing about Beatles fans. To them, it does. So anyway, the other thing to remember is in 1963, the Beatles were an incredibly tight live band, having paid their dues in some shitholes in Germany and the UK for the last several years. I mean, they were a punchy, loud, and for the time, like, raucous live band.
And I think this is why the Beatles were so relatable, is that they did have like actual documented roots of being like not a big deal, and then they were. Right,
that's a great point.
Like it makes the fans feel like connected to them. Like, oh, they weren't always a big deal, right?
Great point, Gwen. An underdog story,
yeah,
a grassroots campaign, right?
Yeah. Whereas the later '60s, they're like when Rocky's like in Rocky IV or whatever, where he's like just so good, like, and it's just ridiculous, and you can't even like imagine that he ever was bad.
What a comparison!
Yeah, you know what I'm saying?
The Rocky IV. By the
like
time
in Rocky I, I mean, he's a loser.
Yeah, his
like,
house stinks.
He doesn't even win at the end of the movie. He stinks.
He doesn't win. I mean, you're right about that.
Sorry for the spoilers, but
if you've ever heard of Rocky, don't watch it.
We'll
now,
do the Rocky podcast. We'll explain everything to you.
There you go. So their second album is known as With the Beatles. That was the fall of '63. So that's 2 albums a year. That pushed their image further, and that's when the UK started to experience Beatlemania. The UK,
United Kingdom.
Yes, United Kingdom.
Not United something else.
Greatest
United
Britain.
Kangaroos or whatever.
Yeah, United Untied Kangaroos.
Yeah.
Untoward Kangaroos.
Yeah.
Shut up.
Anyway, with their mounting fame, the Beatles had planned a trip to the United States of America on the backs of their latest big singles, which actually landed over here. She Loves You and I Want to Hold Your Hand.
Right.
Prototypical Beatles songs,
I think
right?
that should be said for the anthology here. Now, wasn't like the first American releases like they were like some weird ass like company released them or something? Like they were just like, oh, we got this, or it was it's jank is all I have to say about it.
It was jank. So EMI was owned by Capitol Records.
Yeah.
But they did not want to distribute the first few singles. So they were on shit like VJ and Swan Records and stuff like that. And the first Beatles album was known as Introducing the Beatles, but their first proper one that they got in the UK off Capitol was Meet the Beatles. Now, for the record here, I'm going to throw this in now so we don't have to come back to it.
Right.
In the United States of America, the albums were released under different titles some of the time.
Yeah, this
songs all fucked up.
This feels like a very like 60s, 70s practice, even like for all media, like how like they would like change the name of Japanese cartoons in America,
right.
or like
it's a Final Fantasy series.
Yeah, like anything like not from here, they're always just like, we don't know if this is gonna work, and let's fuck with it. Like you know what I mean?
That's
like,
what they did with the Beatles.
Yeah, they did the same thing. It's actually not surprising considering like all the myriad of examples of any kind of media that came to America.
And the Beatles were pissed about it. Nothing they could do. Capitol owned EMI. Like they couldn't be pushed around. But I do want to mention that by the time the CD reissues in '87 took place, they released them the same in both countries with the original lineup that was in the UK. So the UK albums now, if you grew up with the Beatles on CD, that's the canon. Those that grew up on LP had to like readjust to the canon.
It's just like Final Fantasy, where they finally decided like let's put all the numbers, and then they re-released all of them with the numbers. It's like it's that.
It's that. It's exactly that.
It's like if you're from past that time, you don't even know that the numbers weren't there.
Exactly.
I'm not here to bash the US album catalogue. All of the Capitol albums, perhaps with the exception of the early Beatles and the Beatles Story, were highly entertaining albums, and I totally get why they are held in such high regard by those who grew up with them. But nowhere is Capitol Records' crass attitude and lack of respect towards the Beatles' music illustrated better than on this album.
So the Beatles landed in the U.S. On February 7th, 1964, gave a very memorable press conference at JFK where the American media and, the fans watching TV at the time got to learn that not only are the Beatles very popular musically, they're very witty and very, very funny.
Could you please sing something?
No! Sorry. Next question. You can sing. No, we need money first. How many are bald that you have to wear those wigs? To all of us. I'm bald. You're bald? Oh, we're all bald. Don't tell anyone, please. I'm deaf and dumb, too.
They did the Ed Sullivan Show 2 days later on February 9th. Now, we've talked about a lot of classic TV and old things, and we always try to paint the picture of the landscape of TV in its early days, 50s and 60s.
The landscape.
Ed Sullivan had been on since like 48 or 9.
Right.
He was an institution by 64.
Right.
Americans watched Ed Sullivan to see the hottest new music acts and comedy and whatever. That's what you did.
Would you say, in essence, like he was sort of like a Johnny Carson figure? You know what I'm saying? Like
his show was
the show's
comparable
not the same
to the
thing.
level of celebrity you could attain by being on it. Yes.
Right. I'm not saying it's
he
the
was
same
nowhere. He was not.
Yeah,
Johnny
no, I'm not saying
Carson.
it's the same type of show. I'm saying that he's like a fixture person.
An institution.
Right.
Yes.
Now tonight the whole country is waiting to hear England's Beatles, and you're going to hear them, and they're tremendous ambassadors of goodwill after this commercial.
That appearance, which is very famous to anyone that's ever seen it, and Beatle fans in general, that was it. Now the Beatles were everything.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Beatles.
Close your eyes and I'll kiss you. Tomorrow I'll miss you. Remember, I'll always be true. And then while I'm away.
To the chagrin of their parents of the silent generation, right, or the greatest generation, I suppose, these baby boomer kids, it was all Beatles now.
They love this crap.
This is what Elvis did to the teens of the 50s.
Yeah. I feel like what's one of a piece of media where I finally understood why the greatest generation was like confused and befuddled by the Beatles. I don't know if you've ever seen this episode. There's an episode of Mad Men where Don takes his daughter to a Beatles concert. He's Don, so he obviously like smokes a joint with them and acts all cool and shit.
Yeah.
But he's also just like, there's this like fucking disgust with this whole like whatever this is, right?
Of course.
Like and it just kind of like, I got it because you've seen through the eyes of Don in the show from that point. So you're like, this must seem like fucking weird. Like,
well, I got to experience not firsthand but secondhand the stories about this from my dad and my uncle, who were both born in the mid-50s, and my grandparents, who were born in the 20s. There's a generational gap. My grandparents were raised and reared on Sinatra, on jazz trios, on big band, right? And then my dad and my uncle, who are very close in age, this was their demo. They were 9 years old when the Beatles came. Right? To my grandparents, it was like, this is just kind of like loud noise, which is what people thought about Elvis. And it was,
they thought it was like unskilled music. They were like, I think that's because they were so used to before that, it was like you had to be like a really accomplished musician to even break through, to even be in those big bands or whatever. Like,
I mean, those are no joke. A jazz drummer
you
or something.
You got to know what the hell you're doing. The people of that time who were older when the Beatles came around, they're like, these guys have no skill. Like, who the hell are
they're
these
just
people?
shouting their lyrics.
Yeah,
like,
who the hell are these people, right? Who do they think they are?
Who the hell are these?
And why did the kids love it so much? It's crap.
It's crap!
And why is their hair so long?
Right,
Which that was like a big deal.
The long hair is just kind of a goofy thing to me in retrospect, but it's more the like musicianship was not like respected.
Not at all.
Which is funny coming from like the Beatles are like one of the most accomplished ever, but to the people before them, they were just kind of like, what is this shit? What the hell is this? This is crap.
Right.
Like this is actual crap in their eyes.
And I think the best way to describe it now, and I mean to offend no one's musical sensibilities with this, is if you were in your teens when a male or 20s when the Backstreet Boys were very popular, or NSYNC, and you're like, what is this crap?
Yeah.
This like soft pop crap.
Yeah, this junk.
But then if you realize, like, okay, these guys are all actually very, very good singers, and they have they're very good. That's kind of how the Beatles were viewed at first in America. It's like, what is this teeny bopper shit? Like, this is not music.
I think that the reason, and again, this kind of feeds into the anthology, is that the development of the Beatles from a more pop band to a more psychedelic and artistic band is really like why the anthology is important to me, because I never really understood that. It all merged together for me as a child, just hearing it. I couldn't tell the difference between like early Beatles and late Beatles. I didn't know when any of this stuff took place.
Right.
All I knew is that like, and that's the Beatles, and that's the Beatles. Right. I guess they just have a lot of songs, you know?
Sure. So by 64 in the U.S. and elsewhere, the Beatles were ubiquitous. They were scrutinized. They were the subject of rumor
and innuendo.
But they didn't just permeate the record charts. They invaded the culture here in the U.S., and here's one of the reasons why. American rock and roll by that point was kind of dead, and dingly-dangly songs, some were very good, don't get me wrong, but like Elvis was not doing rock and roll by the mid-'60s. He had been making movies. He was doing more country-ass stuff. Little Richard had like faded away. Gene Vincent, there was Pat Boone, but like everyone made fun of him because he was just like, he would cover Little Richard like horribly.
Oh, bop, bop, a loom, bop, a lop, bop, bop, tutti frutti, oh, Rudy, tutti frutti.
You know, long, tall Sally, like with the deep voice.
It's so interesting to me, actually, that the guys who kind of like established this genre, their time had passed already by the time the Beatles came along. They were
really
like,
weird.
They were like, okay, we did our things and now we're done, right? We're older now.
Elvis hadn't even had his comeback special yet. That wasn't until later.
And that's not even to say that these artists weren't still performing and stuff. They just weren't, they weren't hip anymore.
It wasn't hip.
They were just kind of like, okay, we had our time in the 50s, like usually how this stuff works, right? And they were gone.
The biggest thing the U.S. had was the Beach Boys. Right. Who were very, very popular at the same time. But this Beatles sound was this weird British fusion of American rock and also pop and also like little bits of other influences. It was more rambunctious, sloppier than American rock and roll would be. And again, with the four of them, their personalities, there wasn't just one lead singer. Three of them sang lead, and like Ringo had a number, every now and then he would sing.
Right.
So this was different than like Cliff Richard and the Shadows.
Right.
Jerry and the Pacemakers.
Yeah, the idea that all of them were like kind of equal members, right? It wasn't like we're featuring somebody.
Right.
Right.
All four were equal.
And I think that made them marketable too, because then it was like, women were like, "Oh, I got my favorite Beatle," right? And even men, because they became so popular, I feel like they were kind of like, especially once they changed, I think they became unisex. Like they weren't just like a women's band anymore.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, you know what I mean? Like they became just cool in general.
Once they proved that they were here to stay throughout 64, it wasn't just like a
it was
teenage
male
girl
and
thing.
female
Absolutely.
were into it.
And
right?
you weren't ashamed to be a Beatles fan.
Right.
Regardless. So more albums and movies follow because, of course, as we talked about, even last time, hey, Desi Arnaz, get him in a movie. It was the same thing. Let's get these Beatles marketed into a movie quick.
I feel the Beatles are kind of like on the edge of this.
Yes.
Like of the grand Hollywood tradition of, the biggest musician of the time has to be in a movie. But I feel like the Beatles are kind of like the end of this shit.
Maybe.
And I don't know if it has to do with the style of movie they ended up making, because it's like some avant-garde
Well,
thing.
the first one is very good.
It's filmed in a way where it's almost like French New Wave or some shit.
Like that early 60s movement, you mean?
Yeah.
I think it was.
Yeah, it's like it's so like the way it is, it tells me all I need to know is that Criterion like made it a Criterion classic.
Yeah,
movie. I'm like, okay, so like, and like when you look back at how it's shot and stuff, you're kind of like, this is a weird French New Wave style movie. It's very odd.
It's Dick Lester, by the way.
Yeah.
And we're talking about 1964's Hard Day's Night, which the album Hard Day's Night was meant to be like a soundtrack to the film.
Just for once, let's all try to behave like ordinary, respectable citizens. Let's not cause any trouble, pull any strokes, or do anything I'm going to be sorry for, especially tomorrow in that television theatre. Because... Are you listening to me, Lennon?
You're a swine, ain't George?
You're a swine. Thanks.
Hard Day's Night was a huge album. That's the one that has things we said today. Can't Buy Me Love, I Should Have Known Better, If I Fell, and I Love Her. I could rattle them on and on. Then later in 64, Quinn's personal favorite title, Beatles for Sale.
Yes, Beatles for Sale.
At the end of 64.
That was the album where they sold the Beatles.
They sold them. This album was actually probably one of their least well-received, but it's still a huge seller.
It's not bad.
It's fine.
From my memory.
I like it. It's fine. And then we head into 65 with another film, and that was Help, which was meant to be like a James Bond parody. This was a lot more silly and goofier.
Yeah, this one's more. This isn't like Hard Day's Night.
No, this
is
is
Hard Day's Night.
color.
It's a serious movie.
It's a documentary. Hard Day's Night, right?
Yeah.
Mockumentary.
Yeah.
Help is like a farce, and it's silly.
Hey,
My skin's soaked right through to the skin.
There's more here than meets the eye.
Ho ho! Ho ho! Ho 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 ho! Ho ho ho!
And I feel like that set the tone for the more late 60s Beatles, where they were like kind of like they were willing to make fun of themselves.
Yes,
right?
and they were on weed all the time too by this point.
Yeah,
but thanks,
it's
Bob
true.
Dylan. And then the accompanying album, Help, a huge one. First of all, the single Help, huge
Help is
Beatles
great.
song to
Yeah.
this day. It has You've Got to Hide Your Love Away. It's got Ticket to Ride. It's got Yesterday, their most covered, I think, most sold song, or at least
Is
most
that
famous
true?
song.
Wow.
Their most covered one is Yesterday, or was.
Wow.
Yeah, definitely.
I did not know that.
Oh, it's got a lot of...
I never really thought about what their most covered song even was, to be quite honest.
That
until you said
song, that song's become like a de facto standard at this
Yeah.
point. You know what I mean? Where it doesn't even matter who wrote it. It's just like a song that people know, right?
We'd like to do something now which we've never ever done before, and it's a track of our new LP. And this song's called Yesterday. And so, for Paul McCartney of Liverpool, Opportunity Knocks.
And then their big groundbreaking album. This is where they really started to get more artistic. And this is one of my personal favorite albums. This is the winter of 65 or the fall. Rubber Soul.
Rubber Soul. So this is like the change album,
Yes.
right? This is like where things are different now.
They were trying to stay neck and neck with the Beach Boys, who right around the same time were starting to change their sound in 65.
So I always thought that was interesting because I feel like the Beach Boys don't get this credit that they were like truly the Beatles' rivals / contemporaries, right? Like they were like
yes, more than the Stones.
They were the ones where like the Beach Boys were considered like it was like the Beatles and the Beach Boys, right? It was like that. Those are the two serious bands.
You know what it was, Quinn? That's a very astute observation. By this point in 65 and for the next year or two, they were vying for the same thing, which was the critical and artistic acclaim.
Right. And I think that's also just part of the Beatles shift in general, too,
Yes.
right? Is that they had conquered the pop thing. And it was fairly easy for them to do because they were good. Just like the Beach Boys, right?
Yeah,
it's like
absolutely.
bands like that, when you're just good and you just write songs like nothing, becoming a pop band is like that's like a layup.
That's the easy part.
Right. It's writing songs for all time and becoming like legends. That's the work, right?
And breaking new ground, right?
Yeah,
and being
yeah.
innovative. And that's what Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys and Paul and John of the Beatles really were striving for. Because a lot of people compare Beatles and Stones, and that's because they're both from England and they knew each other, but their music is very dissimilar.
Right.
The Beatles and Stones, they were doing two totally different things. The Stones just wanted to fucking do drugs, have sex, and party. And be popular.
The Stones were a rock and roll band.
Yes, they were.
They were the prototypical,
And a damn good one.
You know, like what do you call the groupies and the the sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Have you seen Mick Jagger?
Yeah,
Right?
exactly. So it's like it's a different vibe.
Yeah. But back to the Beatles scene here. Rubber Soul was a huge one. This has Drive My Car, Norwegian Wood, Michelle, Girl. This has a ton of songs. Also, keep in mind, they've been touring this whole time, and it's getting increasingly harder and harder for them to play well because of all the screaming. Just remember that.
They're trying to become an artsy-fartsy band, and they don't have time for this crap
They're getting
anymore.
sick of this crap.
Yeah.
Here we go. The next song that we'd like to sing now is one which was our last but one record, the one before this. And the record, this is called Ticket to Ride.
They famously played Shea Stadium in August of 65, the first big stadium show for a rock band ever.
Right.
You know, this is a huge deal.
It's weird that they even established that.
They did.
And they're kind of like considered like the anti stadium show band in retrospect because of their famous like withdrawing from doing that.
Oh, yeah. And that would happen with their next album. So in 66, they reconvene to record the even more boundary challenging Revolver.
Now we're getting real close to the I feel like Revolvers, we're on the edge of okay, now we're a psychedelic band.
Now
right?
we've got not only weed but LSD coursing through the songwriting. Yeah. Now they're competing with the Beach Boys' magnum opus Pet Sounds. Right? Revolver, which was released in August of 66, this has Eleanor Rigby. This has Taxman. This has Tomorrow Never Knows. She Said, Got to Get You Into My Life. Yellow Submarine. It has tons of good songs. I'm just rattling this off my head. I have none of this written down. They changed the way they recorded their drums. They put things through limiters that they hadn't done before. All sorts of techniques.
The music nerds coming out being look at this. Look at this shit.
Their young, fresh-faced new engineer, Jeff Emmerich, who was 20 at the time, he gave fuck all. He was like, I'll do anything. I don't care if I get in trouble.
Yeah, Jeff Emmerich.
Quinn making the sly face. Yeah. But anyway, the point here is in August of 66, Revolver was released. And also in August of 66, on August 29th, as a matter of fact, I have the poster in my living room. The Beatles played their very last live show in Candlestick Park.
Right.
August 29th, 66.
I'm gonna take me.
And that was it. Because you got to remember, years of touring. We're going back to 60 in Hamburg, Germany, and things
German
like that. Right.
Dumps.
They've been mobbed. They've been scrutinized. They've been traumatized. They've been shuttled around, cattled around, herded.
What I find fascinating about this is that it feels like they retire from touring to go on Mount Olympus and write the greatest songs ever. It's almost like they've ascended. You know what I mean? They're above this thing.
They had outgrown the touring thing.
Yeah.
So they, in the winter of 66, going into 67, they reconvene in the studio, and we get Sgt. Pepper underway. Strawberry Fields, Penny Lane comes out as a single, and the Sgt. Pepper album, which, again, so much has been said about this, but this is where they have mustaches.
Yeah, so here's what my feeling is on Sgt. Pepper. It's very, very good.
I still agree, yes.
It's legitimately one of their best albums.
I think so.
No doubt about it. Even the cover art is revolutionary. Everything about it. You opened it up and there was all this shit in it or whatever.
Yeah.
It's fascinating, right?
Yes.
That being said, I think that sometimes it gets overblown how good it is, and I think that's more me complimenting the Beatles to say is they're so good that even their best album, it's disputed because they're so fucking good, right? It's the fact that an album that a lot of people say is the best thing ever made is topped by their own stuff, arguably, is kind of crazy in and of itself, right? It's to me, this is kind of the high water mark. This is the mark of what the Beatles they can be. Right? This is how excellent they are.
You know, it's interesting. I really like that you said that because I know you don't know this, but you're right on the money. For years and years and years, Sgt. Pepper would always appear at the top of all these best album ever lists, and the general critical consensus is that Sgt. Pepper was the best. However, in the last 15 to 20 years, Revolver has actually taken that mantle.
I think Revolver's a little too much because I feel like that's purists trying to say no, it started here. I would say the White Album or something like that album.
I fucking love the White Album.
Something like that afterwards
Abbey
or whatever.
Road.
Those can to me they hold a candle to Sgt. Pepper. You know what I'm saying?
Fair enough. Yeah.
It's the post Sgt. Pepper.
Okay.
To me, it's more of a it's a marker between they're this now. They were becoming this in Revolver and Rubber Soul, but they're this. This is they have arrived at what they are at Sgt. Pepper. Does that make sense?
Sure. To try to wrap up the last couple of years here, so Sgt. Pepper was a spring of 67. Then they had the big summer of love. They did All You Need Is Love live on TV, right? International transmission.
Does Yoko Ono get involved around this time?
Yeah. In the summer of 67, I think.
Just asking.
Yeah, she had met John already by then. She's not in the studio yet much, but Magical Mystery Tour in the UK was a double EP, and in the US was an album.
I love this album because it's
so goofy.
It's goofy, but it's actually not. It's not as bad as the Submarine one.
No, it's not.
It's kind of fun goofy.
It's got Eye on the Walrus on it.
Yeah, it's got some fun shit on it, right? It's actually not bad to me.
Full on the Hill.
I always felt that I'll say this: Magical Mystery Tour and Sgt. Pepper. I feel. I always felt like Magical Mystery Tour is like the extension of Sgt. Pepper's. It's not a real album. It's kind of like this, like it's like
it's somewhat but it's very junior.
Yeah, it's
very junior.
But it almost feels like intentionally junior. Like I don't know any other way to describe it. It's like intentionally like, oh, here's like the extra shit we didn't get to fit on the other one, right? It's like
it feels that way, yes. Yeah. The Magical Mystery Tour movie came out, which was panned, which is just them just improvising, riding around in a bus with various like scenes cut in. It's really, really weird.
Yeah, fellas. Ooh, talk about your magical mysteries. I spent half an hour looking for that sugar, I tell you. They all look. I was half an hour looking for the sugar. Is there one for me? There's one over here, Richie. Oh, how are you, Bonzo?
Now, by 68, they go to India. They're there for a while. The Maharishi, Transcendental Meditation, blah, blah, blah. Right before they leave, though, they release a great single. They release Lady Madonna. Awesome song.
Madonna.
Great song, right? Mm-hmm. And they record Hey Bulldog, which resurged. That was like, no one knew that song, and it's like a big YouTube hit now because the video
cared for it that much.
I love Hey Bulldog.
Yeah.
Are you serious?
It's okay.
Okay.
I don't see it as like what these young kids see it as. I'm like, oh, it's another good Beatles song.
It's a good Beatles song.
I just don't, it's not like up there or anything.
Okay. So by 68, they start to forego a lot of the studio trickery that had, permeated Revolver
trickery,
and Sgt. Pepper, Jeff Emmerich, and Magical Mystery Tour. UK is not untoward kangaroos, Quinn. Yeah. The White Album came out in the fall of 68, a laborious process making this one. Fractious, a lot of problems, a lot of Yoko, okay? Mm-hmm. The White Album, however, is, in my opinion, a fantastic double album.
Very, very, very good.
Every song on there, for the most part, except for a couple of crappy ones, I really like.
I do feel like they're flexing their muscle, though, with a double album. There's bound to be some stuff.
Yeah.
That's long.
Like, it was unnecessary to even make it a double album. They could have chipped it out.
This feels more like, almost like they dared themselves to do it. We're so good that we can write 2 albums in one.
They did, though.
The
biggest thing to come out of these sessions, though, was not even the White Album. It was another huge single, the B-side of which was Revolution, an enduring song to this day.
Right.
But the A-side, Hey Jude, another huge song for the Beatles. I mean, a massive song. Everyone knows Hey Jude. How could you not want to sing along to the ending part with a na-na-nas?
It's good.
It's a classic song, right?
I always like when they put it in Royal Tenenbaums, by the way, just saying. Like, I always thought that was good placement.
But I'll tell you what wasn't good placement, the Beatles' lives in 1968 going into 69, because John Lennon and Yoko had, done their thing. Let's just say they're doing their thing. Lennon's separated from his wife, Cynthia. Paul McCartney grows a beard, and he's with Linda Eastman now, soon to be Linda McCartney.
Forever.
And George is still with Patty, Ringo's still with Maureen. Anyway, Paul, as always, let's get the band working, because Brian Epstein had died in August of 67. Their manager, their longtime manager, legitimately, had passed away, and Paul was trying to hold it together. And the other 3 thought he was just trying to boss them around, but he was really just trying to keep them the Beatles, I think, anyway.
I can see from the perspective of the other Beatles, it was like, you weren't the boss before, like, who the fuck are you to, like, be the boss, right?
Well, the thing is, I don't think he wanted to be, it's just John
he
was
just kind of had to be.
Yes,
yeah,
John didn't care.
But again, I'm saying, like, I see it from both sides. I see Paul's like, well, if no one's going to, like, run the damn thing, like, I'm going to do it. Right. Yes. And then the other guys are like, well, wait a second. We had the other guy run it before. You're not supposed to run it. You're one of us. Like, why are you telling us what to do?
And John was always the leader, know, in terms of the 4 of them.
You've always been boss. I've been since secondary boss. But not always. Always.
A lot of this period in January of 69 is very well explored in both the Let It Be documentary and the recent, last few years, Peter Jackson wonderful job in the Get Back documentary.
Right.
Which really did a wonderful job painting this in a much more positive light than Let It Be had in 1970.
Is that one called I've Got a Feeling?
It's called I've Got a Hard On.
Everybody had a hard on.
Everybody had
except
a hard
for me
on.
and my monkey.
A guitar fell over, Paul. A guitar fell over.
A surprise audience that might come tomorrow, or
I'll just thought I'd let you know. Thank you. And now, your host for this evening, the Bottle. Yes, Paul, you'll have to be strict. Some discipline. Get a shave, get your fucking hair cut.
The point I'm trying to make, though, is that they were fractious, but they were still getting shit done. They did do the rooftop concert.
They were pros.
They were pros, right.
I feel like the professionalism held up in the late 60s. That was the only thing that kind of kept it together, but at the same time, it was eating away, right? It was like they stopped being like friend. They weren't not friends, but they weren't the same kind of, this is a tight-knit group of guys that are writing songs from the heart. They're like, now we're a business, man.
That's what it was, because they had formed Apple Corps.
Right.
A little pun there, in 1968.
It's a business concerning records, films, and electronics. And as a sideline, whatever it's called, manufacturing or whatever. But we want to set up a system whereby people who just want to make a film about anything don't have to go on their knees in somebody's office, probably yours.
That failed, and again,
not to be confused with Apple Computer Company.
Different
if
Apple.
You ever heard of that?
This was first.
Yeah, Apple Computer Inc.
Now, again, Apple Corps could be its own episode. This is why we have to be brief here, folks. I know I'm leaving stuff out. I have to.
I feel like we need to mention it, though, for Anthology.
It's being mentioned, right.
All this stuff is building to the Anthology.
Exactly. There's a reason here. So it seemed like they were on the outs. What are we going to do? We have Apple now. John, George, and Ringo, and again, I'm covering this very tangentially, want to bring in this fellow named Alan Klein to manage Apple. Paul does not want that. Okay, I'm keeping it very basic. 3 of them want this guy, Alan Klein, who had a reputation, let's say, in multiple ways.
Why can't they outvote Paul? They're 3-1.
They did. So that doesn't mean that anyone was happy about it.
Yeah, I know.
So the spring and the summer of 69, that's when Bryan Adams, I guess, got his first real 6-string, from what I understand.
Oh, that was nice.
Bought it at the 5 and dime. Anyway, they produced the Beatles' last album to be recorded, not released because cool, Abbey Road.
Right. So this is the confusing part for a lot of people, right? Everyone knows in lore, in canon, that Let It Be is the last one, but technically through some weird release snafu,
they kept holding Let It Be back.
This shit is like Final Fantasy again. What happened to the other one, right? It's like it somehow is Abbey Road is the end, but it's not the end.
It is the end. It was just Abbey Road was recorded last.
Yeah.
Let It Be was recorded in January of 69 during these sessions that are captured on documentary. However, they hated it, and it took forever to get it. Glenn Johns came in to mix it, and they hated both of his mixes. They finally had Phil fucking Spector do it in 1970.
Yeah, that guy.
That caused murder. That caused problems with Paul McCartney and the Beatles also. Bottom line is Abbey Road was a very good album.
Right.
Recorded reasonably well with good spirits among the group. There were still problems. However, and this didn't come to light until much later, in September of 69, John Lennon privately quit the group. But the reason they kept it private is because they were renegotiating a deal with Capitol. And they would have had very little clout if they were like, oh, we're not a band anymore.
Right, yeah.
You know what I mean?
It's like, why the hell are you signing us?
Right. So they get the deal signed.
Also, why are they dealing with Capitol at this point?
Because Capitol owns EMI.
Yeah, but what about Apple?
They didn't put their own stuff out through Apple for the most part.
I thought
they did
last stuff
just
was.
Let It Be and some singles.
Oh, Abbey Road didn't count?
Abbey Road is Capitol. Is
really?
EMI, yes.
Oh, I didn't. I always thought Abbey Road was part of that. Why is it called fucking Abbey Road then?
No, it's because they have a contract with EMI still. So they were doing shit through Apple, but it was still under EMI. They just slapped the Apple label on it.
Okay.
It's all real. You ever hear of Zapple? That was real.
Zapple? Yes, yeah. I have heard of it.
That's amazing. All right. It becomes apparent to all the other 3, hey, I don't think John's coming back. Because, Ringo walked out during the White Album briefly. George walked out during the Let It Be sessions briefly.
There's been walkouts before, so people just expected, John, the rest of the band's like, sometimes we get a little angry.
Right.
And he'll come back in a month or 2.
He'll be back.
He
didn't come back, right? Did the Plastic Ono Band.
Yeah, he started farting around doing his own shit, right? That's probably when they knew.
And that's when the others started doing the same thing.
Yeah.
Because George had a backlog of songs that he wanted to record. Mm-hmm. Ringo was like, maybe I'll do an album. And
everyone's like, Ringo.
And Paul...
Just saying.
And Paul's like, I'm gonna go to my farm, in Scotland.
And then I'm gonna make that album cover where I have a big coat on and a beard. This, and my wife, and we own a farm now.
And the cherries.
Yeah.
And that's what he did. He recorded McCartney. That became his first album. And even the release schedules of Ringo's Sentimental Journey, which was his first album, the Beatles' own Let It Be, right? Mm-hmm. And Paul's McCartney. Even
between all of that, by the way, gotta say, that That's a lot of fucking music from these four people within a very short span of time.
And George is going hard as he can on recording his triple album, All Things Must Pass, right?
Right.
So Paul McCartney puts out this press release to coincide with the timing of his album McCartney, which was April of 1970. And in that, he intimates that he's left the Beatles. For years and years and years, Paul McCartney is the one blamed. Paul quit the Beatles.
Right.
Now, again, we're not here to uncover that. That's been uncovered. John left first. The three of them were just trying to hold it together. Eventually, Paul's like, well, you know what? Fuck it. If you're not going to say it, I am. The Beatles are over.
It's over.
Enough already.
Moving on now.
Yeah, we're moving on here. Here's my fucking album.
Apple Corps can release the McCartney albums or some shit. And Ringo's albums, of course. I mean, that's definitely what the label's known for, is the Ringo albums.
He had a couple good ones.
He
did.
I just
be
always
fair to Ringo.
It's not that I dislike Ringo. I just he's just not as cool or something.
He's just Ringo.
Yeah, he's just it's like Garth or something.
Play your drums.
It's like, we appreciate you. We'll token buy your albums or whatever, but just go do your thing, man.
Just play drums.
Yeah.
Now, reasons have been canonized themselves over the years. Again, another Beatles podcast. Why did they break up? Yoko is blamed, the death of Brian Epstein, end of touring.
It seems to me.
Yep.
That
I want your take.
It's just like a natural, they were just tired of it. That's it.
There you go.
People can blame all these factors, but this is just life, guys. This is like, one guy gets a girlfriend. She's like, I'm not really into that thing you're doing. And he's like, you know what? I agree with you.
I'd rather do the drugs with you.
I'd rather go or make my own music or something.
Be naked.
Yeah. And
here's my penis.
That's not wrong.
No, it's not.
Because those two were married till John died. It's not like it was some flimsy relationship.
And then Paul and Linda were married until Linda died.
Exactly. It's not like these were bad these were relationships that lasted quite a long time.
Correct.
So if one of the members and their wife is like, we don't want to do this anymore, right? It's I'm sorry, but that's just, you just got to kind of go with it.
You also have to remember, those of you listening, this is four guys that none of them were 30 yet when the Beatles broke up.
Right. So that's the other aspect that people tend to forget. Every one of these guys had it in them to do something else because they were still young.
They're 29 at oldest.
Yeah.
George was 27.
Right.
When
their
the
life
Beatles
is still ahead of them. Right. It's if you think about it, right?
And not only that, they've been doing this for a decade.
Mm-hmm.
They were just done. And, honestly, they were tired of Paul McCartney.
Yeah.
But they should also be thankful that Paul kept them, the paychecks coming and the things rolling in, too. It's a double-edged sword.
The other aspect to it, I have to say, is that at this point in time, especially because they started getting into the business of it with Apple Corps, they probably thought to themselves, we don't really have to do this anymore, and we'll be taken care of for the rest of our lives because of the discography.
Well, yeah, we can get best ofs and compilations put together. That was part of it. There's a whole royalty thing.
Again, there's all these myriad of reasons why, just from a life perspective, maybe it was time. It was just it was time.
Paul and Ringo would have gone on. George and John were definitely done. Mm-hmm. They were the two that the most were we don't want to do this shit.
They wanted to write shit. They wanted to go do their own thing.
And Paul was like, well, fuck it. I'll do a solo album and another one, and then I'll do another band. But back to Apple Corps. Important to remember, in 1970,
right,
Apple had been losing money for a long time. Like I said, Alan Klein, manager.
Yeah, Alan Klein.
Parodied in the Ruddles as Ron Decline, which is very funny. But anyway, John Belushi. Paul was the lone holdout in all of this. Now, they're locked into a deal as the Beatles legally until 75, I want to say off the top of my head. They're a group legally. Right. Paul wanted out. He sued them at the very end of 1970. So now
why did it matter at that point?
Money. But just be very broad.
I'm
though.
saying
money.
To Paul,
money.
Yeah, no, I mean why did he want them to not be a band officially or something?
Because he wanted out of this deal. He wanted nothing to do with Klein or the royalty deal that they had signed or any of the things that involved the other three with Alan Klein. He wanted to be completely free of all of it. He wanted nothing to do with it.
It's only weird to me just because it's it sounds like it's just free money and you can go do your other thing.
It wasn't though. There was a whole, again, I can't really get into it.
So there was other strings attached.
Yes. Okay. Again, it's not our place to do this. This is not a Beatles podcast, right?
Yes.
It's Acid Wash Memories.
We keep saying that, but we haven't even gotten to the anthology.
Well, we're getting there. This is all necessary.
It's all in the anthology.
So this is the sadder part here. So Paul was actually public enemy number one for a little bit with the other three, especially John and George. Mm-hmm. And behind the scenes in 1970, one of their right-hand men, who was running Apple, had run Apple at the time. He'd been with them forever. Neil Aspinall.
He had a right hand, right?
He also had a left, but he used his right. He was working on a documentary to preserve the Beatles' legacy. This is as early as 1970.
Preserve it.
Preserve. And it was known as The Long and Winding Road after the McCartney song. And it had clips of like tours and TV appearances that they had done. And he had put together like a 90-minute rough cut by 71, but with no involvement from the Beatles. There's no interviews. There's no anything.
I actually didn't know this. So like the preparations were in place for whatever this anthology became in the 70s.
Right after they broke up.
Wow. Now, I always knew that the Beatles, past a certain point, they were very good about documenting what was going on. Like, there's all this like weird footage that even they found recently, and there was like another special where it was like it seems like somebody was always fucking filming around.
They were good at filming after a while. Yeah, they got good at it.
Or at least they were wise enough to say, "Hey, maybe we should hire a guy to just run the fucking camera behind us." Right?
It's true. All right, so here's a very brief rundown of the Beatles in the 70s. John and Paul feuded, and then they made up eventually. It's feuded in 71, 72. Made up by the mid-70s, they were fine. George and Paul feuded because George always was mad at Paul for treating him like a little brother, and Paul was kind of condescending. Anyway, they eventually made up. George and John had their own issues, stemming over George not wanting Yoko at the concert for Bangladesh, among other things. Don't worry about it. And Ringo generally just drank and got along with everybody.
Now,
no one was ever mad at Ringo.
As you're talking about the breaking up and getting back together and shit,
Yeah.
isn't it commonly known that by like around 80 or so, pretty much they were like poised to like get back together for something?
That's the Gaga. I don't know if it's true.
Like
John said that in a legal deposition.
He said they were poised.
Yes, but I think he said that to block the Beatlemania. God, now you're just putting me on the spot. He said that to block Beatlemania, which was a Broadway show where they used Beatles imitators. He said in the legal deposition that we're planning on a reunion, and this will get in the way of that. But I think he just said that.
Even though he just said that, listen.
It was going to happen.
As the 80s rolled through.
It was going to happen.
I mean, the amount of money.
Yes.
On the table for all four of them to even do one fucking concert or something.
Yes.
Right? Would have been way too much to resist, especially when they were older and they had kids and they were like, you know, we want to leave something. Like
it would have happened in the 80s.
You know what I mean? Like we want to cash in on this thing we did 10 years ago, right?
Yes.
It's like...
I'm sure it would have happened in the 80s.
Right.
I firmly believe that. I don't know when.
But I think it would have happened by 85 at the minimum.
I think at Live Aid.
Yeah.
I think Live Aid is when they would have gotten back
or
together.
Or even earlier. They might have just done a Beatles tour.
They could have.
You know?
So throughout the 70s, relationship-wise, some crossovers would occur on albums. A lot of people, the Beatles would always play on Ringo's albums. Right? All not at the same time, but they would all play on Ringo's stuff.
Also the infamous, like, Let's Go Down to Saturday Night Live thing.
That was John and Paul. They almost showed up at Saturday Night Live.
They made a joke bet on Saturday Night Live at like the end of it one time. They were like, I'll give you $1 or some shit.
It was like $2,400 or something. It was stupid.
It was like some extremely low amount of money.
Several months ago, I made a bona fide offer of $3,000 to the Beatles to perform on Saturday night.
And Paul happened to be at John's house watching that over at the Dakota.
And they were like, they were hanging out. It was like Paul and John. And they were just, they were like, why don't we do it? Or something like that. And
they almost did.
Yeah.
Now, in the midst of the 70s, throughout all of it, Apple was dealing with their tangle of legal issues. Again, you can look these up on your own time, folks. But it stems from royalty rights and percentages and tons of other boring shit that we don't need to get into. And like I said, generally it was Paul pitted against the other three. And it wasn't personal, it was business, but it didn't help relations, and it didn't help for the chances at a reunion.
I think Paul's success on his own also kind of made it obvious. It made it natural that it would be the three against Paul, right?
Well, that's true. Wings really did break out. I mean, it really did.
It did. So
Wings was a big deal for a while.
Paul was least incentivized to bring the group back together.
That's a good point. He had already had a second band that was doing well. And to be fair here, like, Ringo had a couple of good hits early 70s and maybe up to 74.
Right.
George had, I mean, his first album, All Things Has Passed, was huge, and then he stayed pretty good, but with declining returns throughout the 70s.
I think John had the most other success, but it was like, to me...
The first two albums.
Right. To me, always, John was in this weird political and legend status where he was like this, like...
He's an activist now.
But also, even when he wanted to make music, it was like when he felt like it.
Yeah.
Right? It felt like... we were graced
Yeah,
with John Lennon.
but not in a good way.
Yeah, there's a little bullshit
It's
with it.
a little bullshit there, Quinn.
But it's like, and he would make sometimes like weird ass shit just
Yes.
because he felt like it. And he's like, well, I'm John Lennon. I'm the guy or whatever.
Meanwhile,
right?
Paul's like, "Oh, you're getting an album whether you want to not, you know."
Yeah, yeah.
You know, I'm gonna give
Paul's
you two.
just like puking out
Yeah.
albums. John's like, you only get one when I feel like it. Like
Paul's like, "Here's my fourth drummer and Wings. If
Yeah.
you like it, you know,
Yeah.
I don't care."
We got
Anyway,
the double guitars over here.
They did. Denny Lane did play one. Anyway, the lingering question, though, throughout the 70s is when will the Beatles get back together, right? It never went away. And then it had to go away on December 8th, 1980, where most of America found out during Monday Night Football, as announced by Howard Cosell.
Right.
Yes, we have to say it. Remember, this is just a football game, no matter who wins or loses. An unspeakable tragedy confirmed to us by ABC News in New York City. John Lennon, outside of his apartment building on the west side of New York City, the most famous perhaps of all of the Beatles, shot twice in the back, rushed to Roosevelt Hospital, dead on arrival.
In the 1980s, George, Ringo, and Paul are more united than they had been in the 70s.
Well, yeah,
It's more cordial.
I always felt that after John's death, that you can tell with all of them that it hit home that we're not going to be around forever.
Right.
And we need to start seriously considering documenting this stuff.
Yes.
Like and preserving it, right? It's like it felt like his death made them realize that like all this fighting, all this stupid shit, it's like we did something important and we need to make sure it's like preserved and it's not splintered and sold to a bunch of people and blah blah blah, right?
I mean, also, Paul didn't want to tour. He didn't tour for the first 9 years of the 80s because of that.
Right.
George put his career on hold for 5 years after 82. He didn't do another album until 87. Ringo barely had a music career by the 80s.
Barely had a career.
He was lucky he was alive, honestly. Now, occasionally, Paul would try to hint at a reunion, usually when he had a record out to promote. And there were always these rumors that the Threedles, as they became known, right, because of the three of them, would reunite with Julian Lennon, who actually, by 84, had a couple of hits and sounds a lot like his dad.
Ever since you've been leaving me, I've been wanting to cry. Now I know how it feels for you. I've been wanting to die, but it's much too late for goodbye.
But I was
Very, very similar.
I always just felt that would have been a pale imitation.
Oh, and they're like, why would we do that to Julian?
Yeah, that's just screwed up.
Yeah.
It's like, wait, now you're just your dad?
Right.
Like, and that's what you're defined as your father? That's like really screwed up. Like
It is, though, and they would never do that to him.
that seemed too cruel, like
Right.
even for, all the feuding and whatnot. right?
Absolutely. So as we get through the mid-'80s here, another thing to remember is Paul had generally shied away from his Beatles past, except for playing a couple of songs in Wings. He tried to reinvent his sound, his image, a lot of his music. But in 1987, the Beatles were issued on CD, which we mentioned
CD.
earlier. Yes, CD. A little late, they could have come out several years earlier, but it took until 87.
I personally think that was a good idea because then it was like, oh, when are the Beatles coming on? You know what I mean? Like the anticipation was building, and those CDs probably sold out instantaneously, right? It was
Despite
like,
the shitty
they
mixing.
probably couldn't print enough of them.
Probably.
Redbook audio, Joe.
Redbook audio.
Like you've never heard it before.
And maybe you never want to if you listen to some of the way some of those are mastered. But anyway, Sgt. Pepper 20th Anniversary had a big push around the time, and that's when it came out on CD. So that was another thing. And Paul started now embracing his Beatle past and dropping references to it in his interviews.
He's old now, Joe.
Because he's in his mid-40s, and you might as well be dead if you're in rock and roll in your mid-40s,
now
right?
it's time to start capitalizing.
And at the same time, George had his big comeback with 1987's Cloud Nine.
Mm-hmm.
And then he had the Traveling Wilburys group with, Jeff Lynne and Tom Petty and Roy Orbison and Bob Dylan.
Now,
They had some hits.
I'm just going to say this.
What?
If you lived in the 90s, none of this shit was that popular. Can we just stop with the, like people were listening to this? Like,
Well, I'm not a fan of the Wilburys,
I'm just, you're saying all these things, and I'm like, what is
Cloud
this?
Nine, no, but Got My Mind Set on You was a huge breakout from that. He didn't write
suppose,
it. You know the song.
Yeah. Well,
That's-
Layla was also a big hit in the 70s and written by George, but nobody...
No, it's Eric Clapton.
Yeah,
it's
but
about George's wife.
It's
That's what you're
something
thinking
George
of.
related. Yeah.
Yeah, so Eric Clapton wrote that.
Yeah.
Derek and the Dominoes. Anyway.
He was the inspiration.
Yes, and Ringo, I think, was Mr. Conductor or some shit. I don't know what Ringo was doing in the late 80s, okay? I don't really care. Oh, well, Shining Time Station. Anyway, we're almost there, folks. So this is how you kill two birds with 1.5 stones. Because what we've done here...
Somebody's going to be like, this isn't enough.
I'm sorry, but like, there's no way that Quinn and I...
We'll have to do the Beatles anthology. We'll have to like make an anthology.
Yeah, like we'll have to do like 28 parts of the Beatles, and maybe people will crave more. Give us suggestions on which angle to approach it from.
Acid wash memories for sale. Yeah. It's the next one.
Very good. Okay. The Beatles were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1988, their first year of eligibility. But Paul didn't attend. I kind of like his reasoning. He's like, we're in a lawsuit still. The others are suing me. It'd be hypocritical for me to show up and act like everything is fine.
And what year is this?
88.
Oh, wow. I didn't know the lawsuit was still going.
Still going.
Still?
Yes. So George and Ringo are there.
I don't have to say much because I'm the quiet Beatle. It is unfortunate Paul's not here because he was the one who had the speech in his pocket.
But anyway, by the end of the 80s, going into 90, Paul's got his comeback album out, Flowers in the Dirt. It didn't do that well. But he did his big tour, which did very well. Guess what? All the legal shit is resolved finally.
We can do things again.
Yes, there you go. And in 1992, work began with agreement of George, Paul, Ringo, and the estate of John Lennon, Yoko, to work together on this project. Also, George needed money due to some very bad business decisions that he had made. Whoopsie. With Handmade Films and some other things, okay? You ever hear of Handmade Films?
When you're a Beatle...
Shanghai Surprise?
Yeah, when you're a Beatle, you can fuck up your money so bad, and all you have to do is like... Here's the hits, and then you're just, money again. Like, it's an unlimited pool of money.
He very begrudgingly participated in this, and you can see it in the interviews in Anthology. He's very grouchy that he has to do this.
Well,
but he needed the fucking money. Maybe don't blow your money on fucking cars.
This is called the eject button.
Yeah.
Don't be angry about the eject button.
I agree with you. Ringo's fine because like, more money from my booze or whatever. And Paul would have done this 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I like talking about the Beatles, So he was hot to trot. But anyway, in 1992... a very long series of interviews started taking place for this project. New project maybe, but really a revival of Neil Aspinall's Long and Winding Road from 1970.
Right. We're going to use that footage.
We're going to use some of the footage that he has compiled.
Look at all of this old Beatles footage. Goodness sakes.
George, of course, because he's always perpetually going to be like this with Paul, and I understand why. He objects to the title because he doesn't want to name it after a Paul McCartney song. God forbid. So
God's still mad about that, huh?
Yeah, I mean, George is just like that with Paul, and Paul asked for it most of the time, to be fair.
But it's weird because when they're older, I've seen them like hanging out together at each other's houses.
They
like,
loved each other, but it's still like this like sibling rivalry type relationship.
It's more like a brotherly thing.
Yeah, they still loved each other.
Yeah.
So the working title they give it is the Beatles Anthology. That's what they call it. Interviews are held throughout 92, throughout 93, and these are all seen in the finished product, obviously. They're in various locations depending on when the interview is, right? Sometimes George has a longer hair. Sometimes George has a mustache. Sometimes Ringo's by his pool. Actually, I think Ringo's always by his pool.
That's true. It's like all the interview stuff like changes a bunch.
Yeah, it's like over like 2 years almost.
Yeah, they like look different in certain things.
Paul's the only one that kind of looks the same, but like sometimes he's driving a boat or he's like at a campfire. Like
there's a lot of weird,
just doing like weird Paul shit.
In fact, there's so many of them now I can't like visualize all of them. Like there's like so many like weird, like I'm talking here now and now I'm talking here, and it's like what the fuck is going on?
And it's like,
how long did they film this? Like 20 years?
It's
like,
literally like 2 years.
Yeah.
Like sometimes George is like in his house with like the crappy hair.
Yeah, this is that's always the like dour one. I don't like the one with the like he's in the fancy room or whatever.
Then there's the outside one when he's got the mustache. That one's okay.
This one's nice. I don't have a problem with that one. With the weird coat.
And then there's another outside one where he's got the sunglasses but no mustache.
This is the one. That's the one where he looks like much older than he looks in the other two. And I don't know how to explain it. It's because his hair is like more fluffy. So it makes his face look like skeleton-like or something. It's so weird.
But then they also did
like Hawaiian shirt.
Then they did supplemental interviews in 95 and he has like his Abbey Road hair.
Completely fucking different. Like, and now he looks like 20 years younger here. What happened?
It's just crazy how
His face is even chunkier. Like he had the skeleton face and now he's got the chunky face in that one.
So I gotta say, one major component to this anthology being a big deal is this is actually the first true film biography of the Beatles involving the Beatles.
That's why it mattered. For a lot of people who grew up with the Beatles, and then for the kids of those people, which were us, who were like, our parents were like, you must watch this.
Right.
And it's like, it's important or whatever,
yes,
right?
It was.
Like, it felt like our parents showing us, I don't know any other way to put it, that these were great men. That tone, right?
Look
it's
at
like
what they did.
These were great men.
Portentous.
And
yes.
you need to respect it.
You need to
right?
understand.
Yes.
And you need to respect this.
Yes.
Right?
It felt like, I feel like everyone's parents took that tone, plopping their kids in front of the TV. What's funny about this is like, it's a very slow plotting.
I was so bored in the beginning. I'm like, what is this?
It's very slow and plotting, and like it feels like it's really like the first big bunch of it just felt like it was for the adults who grew up with it. Like it's all these tidbits and stuff, like things that they maybe speculated about when they were kids, right? It's like boomer catnip, right? It's like and if you're not a boomer, you're like, what the fuck am I watching?
Why are we talking about Ringo's mom? Like, what is this part here?
My mother used to say that because I was born, the Second World War started.
I also want to give a shout out to that point, which had been the most comprehensive Beatles biography, but again, didn't involve them, just people adjacent to them. The Complete Beatles, which is spelled Compleat. That was a big VHS. I think 82 it came out, and
way early for this.
Right,
this anthology thing is way more complete, in my opinion.
It is. Interestingly enough, by the way, Paul McCartney wound up buying the rights to that in the early 90s, so that way it could no longer be sold and it wouldn't compete.
It's
like, really funny.
Just like burn it, basically.
He just basically bought it and to not sell it.
Imagine if he burnt the masters or something. It's just like, this is never...
We don't need this.
Fuck this.
But it's also important to mention the timing here. See, by the 90s, there had been a... Not that the Beatles were forgotten, because they clearly never were, but... In the later 70s, especially in the punk movement in the UK, but just in general...
There was like a pushback against this.
Yeah, it was like this old fart shit, them and the Stones. Like, fuck these guys. And in the 80s, it's not like they didn't have their legacy, but they were passé.
Right.
They were fondly remembered.
I don't remember the Beatles really being included in like MTV, for example. Right.
Right, even though they had a ton of like pioneered videos.
They had actual videos.
Yeah,
but like
in the 60s.
Yeah, but they wouldn't play that unhip shit. Right. You'd have to go to VH1 for that.
Yeah, with Sting. So this was image rehab as well for the Beatles. This wasn't just like, hey, let's make some money. And it was.
Because I do suddenly remember... If I heard the Beatles in the car, sometimes even my parents were kind of like, this again.
Yeah.
Like, and then after the anthology, it was like, this again. Like, it was like people were like, all of a sudden, I think because of the reverence that Beatles Anthology did, as far as like you said, a rehabilitation.
It was.
It even got our parents to be like, it was good. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it got them to reignite that desire for the Beatles.
It basically kicked a bee's nest, kicked a hornet's nest, I think is the phrase, right? It reinvigorated something.
These memories of, like, because a lot of the footage, you have to remember that, again, this is an age before the internet. And I don't think, even the boomers that grew up during this time and saw this footage maybe on TV or...
Saw it once.
20 years ago.
Yeah. 30 years ago.
30 years ago, some of it. And they're like, they're seeing it again and they're realizing like, wow, this really was like special. Like, right?
Yeah, and it's taking people back to being, 10 years old.
And now they can watch it on tape.
Right, on tape.
They can get a VHS.
It's true.
Yeah.
So the special itself was hyped for a while on ABC.
What's your favorite Beatles song? Paperback Writer.
Baby, you can drive my car. In my life.
I'm fixing a hole. Taxman. The ABC stars celebrate the Beatles Anthology November 19th on A Beatles C.
Do you think it's interesting that they decided to air it on TV and not try to sell VHS tapes of it before or something?
Well, because they did that after. They sold it on VHS after. They did it for money purposes, I'm sure, sponsors and
ABC
commercials.
probably paid a shit ton of money to get the rights to be the first place it was going to air, right?
Absolutely.
What was Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds really about? Find out Sunday on A Beatles C.
Big push, though. I remember the hype campaign. They renamed it A Beatles C for a little bit, during that period of time.
They had a little,
campaign.
Did the circle of the ABC become an apple?
I don't remember, but it should have. That's a good idea.
They should have done that.
So the 3 parts aired on November 19th, 95. That was Survivor Series 95, same day. It's hot competition. Yeah. Brett versus Diesel. Wednesday, November 22nd, 1995. And part 3, November 23rd, Thursday.
Yeah,
and
how many parts were there, Joe?
3 on TV.
Because I seem to remember there was 5 or some shit.
So there were 3 on TV in the sense that each hour was a separate part. So it was actually 6 parts, but it was 3 separate days.
That's what I thought. That it's officially 6 or something.
And contemporary reviews at the time were generally good.
I remember that. I remember it was considered this is a really good documentary.
It was.
The Beatles, and they are back, and so are their fans.
To be fair, even at the time, but especially now if you know what to look for, they omit or skirt around certain things, such as a lot of the drug use that John and Yoko were into, the legal issues, the reason for the breakup. A lot of things are passed by.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
How much of this is that they wanted to hide it versus how much of it is that this aired on television and they really couldn't put that shit on TV?
Is that the 4 had to come to a consensus, and so compromises had to be made.
Okay.
The 4 meaning Yoko and the other 3.
Right.
So they all had to agree on what would be in there.
In Yoko's defense here, by the way, her husband's not around anymore.
Correct.
And so she's probably looking at a perspective I don't want to disrespect
John's legacy.
My husband, who's not around to comment and say if he wants this shared or not.
Correct.
Right? So she's kind of in a weird position here.
So one reviewer had summed it up as, and I quote,
"Not a definitive story of the Beatles' history, but rather a diplomatic celebration."
And I think that's a very fair way to put it. It's not every detail. It's not 100% accurate because they're relying on their memories.
Just out of curiosity, it's a weird question. But do you think after all the Beatles are passed away, there's no more Beatles, right? Do you think there'll be a more authentic?
Yes.
Because now they're all gone. Now they're truly in the ether.
I think there will be.
Yeah.
I think there will be. This was released on VHS, like we alluded to, and later DVD, a couple of years later, whenever. In full form, there was some stuff cut out of the TV versions. This is the unabridged version, was released on VHS and DVD, which I have. Of course, I have the DVDs.
Right. The DVDs, to me, I don't remember a lot of people buying the VHS of this. I do remember seeing it in Suncoast Video.
Yes,
and
that's
stuff.
exactly where I saw it.
I remember the DVD was almost it was like a second coming for this thing.
Yes.
Because I remember seeing it, I was I remember that from a couple of years ago. Not a couple, it was 10 years ago by that point or whatever. Because, right? It was 04.
I forget when it came out on DVD, but it was maybe the early 2000s.
Because it was, what was this, 94 when it aired?
95.
95?
Yeah.
Yeah, and DVD didn't really pick up until 01, 02.
That's when it replaced VHS full time.
And I feel like it was a couple years after DVD took off that they were oh, now the Beatles Anthology's on DVD. Yeah. And then that was suddenly it was more affordable. And
yes, it was.
And it was suddenly it was something that I don't think I had, or I might have found it on the interweb. But either way, I definitely.
Oh, you did? You just found it there somehow, huh?
It was lying around on some website. Yeah. E-Bombs World, maybe. I don't know.
God. Something awful.
I'm just kidding.
Now, the buzz, too, at the time, before it came out, was, maybe the Beatles will finally record some new music.
I feel like that's stupid because John Lennon's dead.
Yes, that's very true.
So that can't happen.
Well, it kind of did, because as part of the special, one of the big hypes was you're going to get to hear these brand new 2 Beatles songs at the beginning of, or at the end of part 1 and part 2.
I remember this, but...
So in 1994, they had gone to the studio with Jeff Lynne, who was the traveling Wilbury partner of George Harrison, had also produced Cloud 9, and also that's the only producer that George Harrison would use. Mm-hmm. So we didn't get George Martin, but Paul McCartney got to pick the engineer, and of course he picked Jeff Emmerich. So,
yes, Jeff Emmerich.
He's good. So anyway, "Free as a Bird" was taken from a 1977 John Lennon cassette demo at the Dakota Building. Mm-hmm. poorly recorded, poorly sung, not finished, and they decided, let's use cutting-edge 1994 technology to try to strip out all the background noise, get this thing in sync, work around all the imperfections, and add new music to it and release it as this horrible song, and that's what they did. I don't like the song. I don't like it in its original
Definitely
form
not
either.
as good as Hell Freezes Over from the Eagles.
Absolutely not. Point for the Eagles on that one, Michael.
They got the we're old and now we have new music. They got that done way better.
They killed it. Yeah. And then in 95, they did the same thing with another Lennon song, a better song and better recorded, known as Real Love. This one is, I also don't like. So
there's also, by the way, just to fast forward a little bit.
I don't like either of these songs.
Did you see recently there's like this song where they're like, what if we put John Lennon through AI and then had him sing with Paul and like everyone? And, And like also let's put George through AI or something. Like it was like some dumb shit like that.
I don't know anything about AI.
Well, that's certainly true. Wouldn't you agree? Voiceover guy from the Wendy's commercials, Joe Cirola?
Oh, definitely. I don't think that Joe Murata knows anything about using AI technology.
Just another washed-up humanoid from the armpit of America. Right, Monsoon? Hey, don't make fun of New Jersey like that.
Oh, please. New Jersey is crumbling the way America is crumbling.
Oh, who the hell is doing all of these voices?
Now, they also had done a pass at a song called Now and Then during these sessions. And, of course, that would come out recently.
Yeah. Is that what I'm thinking of with the AI? Or?
No, they actually did do an AI thing, but not they, but that's happened.
I just remember hearing old man Paul be like, this technology.
It
where sounds just like him. Like, it's like,
that's not what he meant. No.
You know what I mean.
He's saying like they used AI to get rid of all the background noise and just have John's vocals. But anyway, not only was it the Anthology TV special and then the VHS set and DVD set, there was a 3-album set. Okay, so the first album, and this is a lot of rare things, a lot of outtakes, some live performances on all 3 of them, alternate things that
this
people.
Shit was good.
They're very good. The first album came out right when the specials did, November of 95. Okay, so good, right?
Yeah,
Free as a Bird also comes out as a single. And I'm a hardcore Beatles fan. I just hate that fucking song. And February of 96, Beatles Anthology 2 album comes out, which is the best one, I think. Right. I really like that one. And then part 3 does not come out until October of 96, a year almost after the specials came out.
I didn't even realize that.
Yeah.
Maybe because it's just like, I remember the premiere, but I don't really remember, like, I just thought it was like over or something because it like wasn't fucking on.
There was the hype and then it's okay, it's done. And then the book came out.
Now the book was interesting. I remember seeing this in like Borders or some shit.
Oh yeah, Barnes and Noble.
I remember like sweeping through it, like and like it was pictures and stuff, right?
You know when that came out?
When?
October of 2000.
Really? It took that long?
Yes. And do you think I have it?
Yeah, of course you do.
I do.
Now, was this? Can I ask a question about all this?
Yes,
is that like because I always got this inclination that the Beatles Anthology project was almost intended to be like a slow drip or something. I got this like.
I think the book was intended. Yes.
Like they were gonna wait,
think so.
Like they were gonna like every couple of years there'd be like new Beatles Anthology content, like, and I think that's like how the whole project was supposed to, like, it was like a media project, right?
I think so. I think it was a multimedia project,
right? There's gonna be music, video, and books, right?
And I don't want to downplay the TV special. It's really, really, really good, and it has a lot of footage, and they cleaned up stuff. I think my favorite Beatle-related thing that I've ever seen, though, is the Peter Jackson Get Back.
Right.
I mean, that now definitely is. But anyway, here's why it mattered. Regardless of what people thought of it, the Beatles that we know, like I said at the top of the show, to this day, a reunited front. Even though it's only 2 surviving members, it's still the cooperating estates of the other 2. That's where this started, where the legal problems are over. Hey, we can make money as a united Apple again. That's really why this matters. So, like, the reason you'll get these deluxe reissues of Revolver now and the White Album, and I think Abbey Road has one.
And ironically, Apple Music versions. And
yeah, which was a whole settlement.
By the way,
that was a whole settlement.
Can I just say how fucking hilarious that is?
Yeah.
That at the end of the day, they ended up that when they finally released their music digitally, it went to Apple Music first.
Yeah.
not anywhere else. And I was like, this makes sense.
Well, the Beatles had to. They lost their deal, so they made a deal with Apple.
Yeah,
Apple Computer,
Apple Computer Company, and now they're all one. Those
Isn't
apples,
that crazy?
Yeah, now they're all friends. Like
lots of good apples.
Everyone's just the apples are all together, Joe,
and they don't fall far from the tree.
Yeah.
Shut up.
Again, this mattered because it allowed what we have to this day to exist. It was very important for the Beatles' legacy and their image, much more than hearing their stories and their interviews, which are entertaining.
I feel like this kicked off their legacy
as
like a legacy. It wasn't anymore like, when are they going to get back together? It was more like, it felt like closure, the Beatles Anthology, in a weird way. Does that make sense?
Yes, it was the end of, when are they going to get back together? No, we did.
Yeah,
the three of us did.
Yeah.
We did our best here.
Yeah.
That part is done. Now we're just going to re-release shit for the end of time, and keep ourselves fresh.
And this is the thing, is that I think a lot of people, like you said before, have like a problem with that or something.
I don't.
I never did, because by the time the Beatles Anthology came out, they were already old. It didn't make any sense anymore. Like, to me, I thought it was a good thing that they started celebrating what they were.
Oh, I think so, too.
I personally feel, even as somebody who didn't live when this music was released, I can recognize that this really was an achievement, and this really is like, this should be in the Smithsonian kind of shit, right? It's like, and I think it was a great idea to gather up old footage so that it was preserved digitally, so that it can't break down, and like, this was the best time to do it, only like 20 years since they were something, right?
Absolutely. And the level of comprehensiveness, I mean, again, it doesn't satisfy everyone's requirements, but of the interviews that they give,
30 years, but
30 years, but the level of comprehensiveness that they give in these interviews, despite it maybe skirting around things and not always agreeing with the others.
It gives enough to give an accurate picture to somebody watching this like 200 years later.
Right.
It's like, this is what the Beatles were.
It gives you like a very good representation of what the Beatles were.
Right.
But again, I think most importantly, it is the reason that you can turn on Spotify right now and listen to the Beatles.
Right.
It's the reason why Peter Jackson's documentary was able to come out a few years ago.
The reason why every couple years there's a new angle now at Beatles content.
Exactly.
Right? It's like, what if we looked at it this way, or like how it relates to this, or the Beatles can be always reframed now in the like, how are they relevant to now? Right? You can make content because the what they were was crystallized with the anthology.
I think that's a great way to put it,
in
Quinn.
digital form, which I say digital because it's very important as far as like things not breaking down. Right?
Absolutely.
It's absolutely very important that was done.
And I think it says a lot about their legacy that people are still talking about them, listening to them, getting interested in them. Kids still get it. My son likes the Beatles. He's 7.
By the way, I think that's an interesting twist, what ended up happening with them even as they got older and older and older and older, because their music was made so long ago, and because by today's standards it's so tame, that it's so easy that it becomes kindergarten songs. Do
not insult the Beatles like that.
I mean it to say is that
you mean it's catchy and good, yes,
and that it's almost educational in a weird way of like,
I don't know what you're saying now,
because it's just, this is what good music
it's
sounds
Mr.
like.
Rogers of music is what you're trying to say.
Yeah, it's like you always give the kids the classics before you give them the new music, right? You grow up with the
true.
The Beatles have become the basics, and I think that's important.
The ABCs.
They become the ABCs of music.
Or would you say the A-Beatleses?
Yeah.
Anyway, I've said that phrase too many times. Folks, there's a lot of meat on this Beatle bone, okay?
Right, Beatle bone.
We cannot...
Big bad Beatle bone.
We cannot chomp away on that big bad Beatle bone any longer. If you want us to do more Beatle-related chatter, let us know the angle to approach it with. We figured we would take you back to the 90s when the 90s were taking you back to the 60s. See what we did there?
Yeah.
We Wonder Years. All right, we did some Wonder Year style
stuff. We did like a double jump or something.
Exactly, which is illegal, but we did it anyway.
There you go.
And next week, speaking of illegal, we're not going to be here. If you're listening lineally, okay? If you're listening as this comes out in November of 24,
Thanksgiving,
we are taking the week off because, yes, we're going to do other things for Thanksgiving and not sit here and record a show.
Right.
We're sorry, okay?
Although I might be stopping in here for some turkey. But...
You will be here, I think. You better be here. Anyway, folks, we're not going to be here next week. We're telling you here now. We'll announce it in the group. But be sure to follow us in that group, Acid Wash Memories. Join it, I should say, right?
Yes.
And also follow us on Twitter at AWM Podcast. Let us know your favorite Beatle album, favorite Beatle member, favorite Beatle mustache.
Let us know how much money you made off when the Beatles were for sale.
Yeah.
How much money did you make off
How much did you make on that deal? Let us know if you saw Anthology when it happened, like Quinn and I did. Let us know if you like it, dislike it. If you have no interest, we still appreciate you listening. One way or another, we'll see you next time for more Acid Washed Memories.
See ya!
Like what you heard? Be sure to leave a review and subscribe on your favorite podcast app. We will see you next week.